The Nereus Research Station is a secret undersea research facility that was built 9 years ago. It's owned and run by the US Navy and located in the western Pacific Ocean. More specifically, it's thousands of feet below the surface on the edge of an ocean trench that plummets to 32,087 feet at its deepest point. Supposedly, the purpose of the Nereus is to study microbial life forms and the effects of ocean acidification on them, although I never believed that explanation. There's far too much secrecy surrounding it for that to be the case. How do I know all this? Because I was on my way there. As our deep-sea submersible descended past the twilight zone, the first seed of doubt took hold and began to sprout. Back in my too big, too empty house in Boston, I'd been sure that this was what I needed. Complete isolation from the rest of the world, a place where I could grieve privately away from the prying eyes of my friends and coworkers. And frankly, I hadn't even expected them to pick me. I'd met all the basic requirements in the job posting. Experience working in remote environments with limited medical support, 3 years of emergency medicine practice, no disqualifying health conditions, etc. But better, more qualified candidates must have applied. Now it was finally hitting me that once I arrived at the Nereus, I wouldn't be able to leave. Not until another doctor came to relieve me. Jack, the pilot of our submersible, must have seen the expression on my face. "Don't you worry," he said not unkindly. "We'll be there soon enough." He had a shock of white hair and a face lined with wrinkles and crevices. He wasn't old, he was ancient. But his hands were steady enough on the controls, and I tried to muster up a smile for him. Closer to the surface, the water had been so uniformly blue that I couldn't tell that we were descending. Here in the abyssal zone, absolutely no sunlight penetrated the water. It occurred to me again what an inhospitable environment the ocean was for human beings, and how little we actually knew about it. More than 80% of our ocean remained unexplored. It was essentially an alien world within our own. "There it is," said Jack. I followed the direction his gnarled finger pointed in and caught my first glimpse of the Nereus. I knew all the basic facts about it, of course. It was a 2-story structure, roughly 8,000 square feet. The first floor consisted of a long tube divided into 3 main compartments, each sectioned off from the other via sliding doors. 6 different pods, rooms shaped like bubbles, then branched out from the entire first floor. They held sleeping quarters, bathrooms, a kitchen, a social space, and a sick bay. The second floor, connected to the first via a ramp, had a dozen pods branching off from it and each other through a confusing warren of long, narrow hallways. The second floor pods held wet and dry labs, computer workstations, and more. Up to 20 scientists, aquanauts, could live in the Nereus at a time. But the description of the Nereus still hadn't prepared me for the actual sight of it. It was beautifully elaborate and defiant, something impossible lifted straight out of a sci-fi novel. By the time I managed to extricate myself from the submersible, I found the station leader already waiting for me, visibly impatient. Alexandra Moreau. Everything about her, from the no-nonsense look in her gray eyes to the brisk efficiency of her movements, screamed military, even though she didn't introduce herself as such. She gave me a quick assessing look before saying in clipped tones, "I'll be giving you a tour of the first floor of the station. Follow me." "Right, thank you." She was already striding down the hallway and I had to break into a jog to catch up with her. A headache had developed sometime in the past 30 minutes, and I struggled to follow along as Alexandra listed off the different sections of the station. The first compartment contained the submersible docking station. The next compartment was the entry lock, and the third one, the biggest, was the main lock. As far as I was concerned, only the following 3 areas mattered to me: the sick bay, the kitchen, and my sleeping quarters. The inside of the Nerus looked much older and was more cramped than I had expected. Rust cropped up in unexpected places, such as around the viewports or along the edges of power doors, and the lights kept flickering. Worst of all, an odd, dank smell permeated everything, insinuating itself into every corner and crevice of the station. It reminded me of the summer I'd spent living in a basement room while studying abroad at Cambridge. No matter what I'd done to try and eliminate it, it stubbornly stayed until I left. Benjamin, Catherine, and Rose are the 3 scientists here at the moment, but there are always 2 technicians. Alexandra was saying when I tuned back in. They monitor the life support systems and fix the little things that break. Jonathan and Ellen. You will meet them all later. When do I get to meet Dr. Miller? Dr. Miller left 2 days ago. Here, this is where you will sleep. It's not crowded at the moment, so you have the pod to yourself. If that changes, however. I knew it wasn't a good idea to interrupt Alexandra, but the question burst out of me before I could stop it. Wait, what do you mean Dr. Miller left? I thought... I trailed off under Alexandra's piercing gaze, but I'd been counting on his guidance. He left very detailed notes, Alexandra said with an air of finality. She reached out and opened the door that led to a small, cramped pod. 2 bunk beds had been stuffed into it, and they were only a foot apart from one another. I couldn't actually imagine sharing the space with anyone else, much less 3 other people. Do me a favor, Dr. Ware, she said abruptly. Don't go onto the 2nd floor of the Narrows without advance permission. Do you have any other questions? I shook my head. She gave me a curt nod and left me standing there, clutching the duffel bag I'd packed with my meager belongings. This was going to be my home for the next 6 months, for better or worse. That night, I had a nightmare. Riley walking through the living room, jingling his keys in one hand as he hummed tunelessly to himself. He paused abruptly and looked at me. His left eye had vanished. The eyelid hung limply over the empty socket. You need to leave, Cordelia, before it's too late. And then he kept walking, up the stairs, down the hallway, into the bedroom. I heard the sound of the bedroom door slamming shut. I knew exactly what would happen next, but I couldn't move. An invisible hand pressed me down onto the living room sofa, and as the seconds trickled by, it began to exert greater and greater pressure on me. It was squeezing me. Like an orange, it meant to squash flat. My skin went taut under the pressure and then split, blood spraying in all directions. My eyeballs went next, first bulging, then popping out from the sockets. My organs were rupturing, the bones beginning to splinter and crack. The pressure relented as suddenly as it had started. Even without my eyes, I could somehow look down on myself. My bones had turned into metal struts, and the muscles and tendons into thick metal wires wrapped around the struts. As I watched, flowers of rust bloomed along my body, huge orange-red petals unfolding over me. I tried to cry out for Riley. My jaw creaked open soundlessly, and the bottom half of it fell away with a loud screech, tumbling to the ground. It looked like a part of a steel-jawed trap. I woke up with a gasp. The nightmare had been so real that I couldn't help checking myself for injuries, frantically patting my face. Reason gradually reasserted itself. I was on the Narrows, lying in the bottom bunk bed. I was here to replace Dr. Miller's, and I would stay here for the next 6 months. And my husband had been dead for almost 12 months. I lay back down, shivering as the sweat cooled on my body. For the first time since I'd learned that I would be staying on the Nerus, I allowed myself to think of Riley. How he used to laugh, with one hand placed against his chest as though to contain his laughter. The way his eyes would light up whenever he talked about fishing or bird watching. I used to joke that he was only interested in hobbies meant for old men. I even missed the little things that had annoyed me about him, like the fact that I always had to say his name 3 or 4 times to get his attention. Cordelia. The voice came sighing out of the darkness, and fear leapt through me, hot and coppery, because that was Riley's voice. Strangely garbled, as though he spoke through a mouthful of blood or water, but I would have known his voice anywhere. And that meant that I was having a nightmare, an extremely vivid and realistic nightmare. Never mind that I felt wide awake. My eyes strained to make out his face in the darkness. Nothing. Except, I thought I could see a slumped shape sitting on the bunk bed opposite mine, only a foot or so away. If I reached out, I was certain I could touch it. Do it then, my mind screamed at me. Do it and you'll see that there's not actually anything there. But I was too terrified to move. And what if there was something there after all? What then? He spoke again, flat and dispassionate. You need to leave, Cordelia, before it's too late. And then silence. Day 2. The next morning, with all the bright fluorescent lights on overhead, it was remarkably easy to convince myself that I'd simply dreamed up the sound of Riley's voice. Of course my dead husband hadn't appeared in the middle of the night to warn me about staying on the Nerus. The idea was laughable in the extreme. I told myself this, and carefully didn't look too closely at the bunk bed. The blanket did seem a little crumpled, as though someone had been sitting on it, but I might have accidentally done that last night. As I walked around the Nerus, headed towards where I thought the kitchen was, I marveled again at how normal everything seemed. Aside from the lattices of rust, and the occasional viewport that showed me the same unrelenting darkness, I almost could have believed that I was back at the surface. Riley would have loved the fact that I was working here, but the thought had barely flitted across my mind before I pushed it away. The kitchen ended up being only 2 pods down from my sleeping quarters. Like everything else in the Nerus, it was cramped and crowded, although in this case it was crammed near to bursting with enough food to feed a small army. There was a microwave oven, a tiny sink, and a kitchen table that was just a square-shaped piece of metal next to the sink. Directly opposite the sink was a vast wall of panels filled with various styles and other equipment, possibly meant for communications. I knew that the Nerus was connected to another underwater habitat called the Proteus, high above us and closer to the surface. They helped provide us with life support, fresh water, and breathing air. A woman in her early 30s leaned against the kitchen counter, rummaging through one of the cabinets. She looked up as I approached her. "Oh, hey! You must be our new doctor, Cordelia. I'm Katie. How are you doing? How are you settling in?" She had a spray of freckles across her nose and a bubbly manner that instantly put me at ease. I smiled back at her. "I'm doing well, thanks. I think I'm still a little shell-shocked by everything here." "I know the feeling. When I first got here, I was so nervous that I almost threw up. It gets to you, you know, how far we are from everything and everyone else, but this is the opportunity of a lifetime." She handed me a bag of freeze-dried breakfast scramble. "Here you are." Before I could thank her, Katie suddenly tilted her head to one side, frowning. "Hey, do you hear that?" "Hear what?" All I heard was the occasional creaks the Nerus made. Katie still stood stock still, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth slightly open as though she'd frozen in mid-sentence. I felt the first stirrings of unease and reached out to gingerly pat her shoulder. "Katie?" Her face went crumpled and hopeless. She reached out to clutch my hands and I couldn't hold back a pained gasp. She was holding on to me tightly enough to leave bruises. Scanning my face as though looking for reassurance, she spoke in a low and furtive tone of voice, like a prisoner passing on a secret message to her cellmate. "The dead are in the walls. I hear them sometimes. Don't you?" And then, as though a tornado had passed, she went back to smiling brightly at me. "What's wrong? Do I have something on my face?" "Katie, I think you should come with me to the sickbay." She scrunched up her nose. "Me? Sick? No way, I feel fine. Anyway, I gotta run, Doc. I stayed up all night to keep an eye on, to run some experiments. If there's anything else I can do to help you out, let me know." She threw the final sentence over her shoulder as she hurried out of the kitchen. "The dead are in the walls. I hear them sometimes." Riley, sitting on the bunk bed opposite mine. No, that had just been a nightmare caused by the stress of settling into an unfamiliar environment and starting a new job. Katie couldn't avoid me forever. The station was too small for that. I made my way to the sickbay, an appetizing breakfast scramble in hand. I hadn't been sure what to expect, but the sickbay was incredibly spacious. One corner of it was clearly meant to be my office. A metal bookcase next to my desk held an extensive array of medical texts, my own personal library. The rest of the room held an exam bed and a range of medical and dental equipment. There was a portable X-ray machine, EKG monitor, and even facilities for me to take a blood or urine analysis. I sat down behind the desk and opened the manila folder lying on it. It had a post-it note with my name on it, although the handwriting was so bad that the R looked like an L. Dr. Miller had left detailed notes. It looked as though he'd spent most of his time on the station taking care of rashes, sprains, colds, and dental issues. All things I felt confident about handling. As I flipped through the station personnel's medical files, I noticed that Katie had started taking sleeping pills a few weeks ago. It would be good to get her in for a basic checkup. Strike that, it would be good to get everyone in for basic checkups. I wanted to establish my own impressions about their baseline health. Movement out of the corner of my eye made me startle and drop the medical files. I whirled around, but all I saw was a giant rust stain on the wall next to me. I propped my chin on my hands as I studied the swoops and swirls of rust. It must have been a trick of the light or the flickering shadows, but it almost seemed as though wavy fingers of rust were creeping down the door, spreading across it. A guttural scream brought me back to myself. I sprinted out of the sickbay, but I couldn't tell where the scream had come from. The air inside the Naru seemed oddly heavy and still, like the air inside of a mausoleum that hadn't been disturbed for decades. I shook my head, annoyed with myself. Stop that, Cordelia, get a grip. Another wordless scream rang through the air, and this time I managed to pinpoint it to the entry lock. I ran towards it, my heart thundering so hard that I half expected it to rip itself loose from my chest. Halfway there, my feet went out from under me. I barely managed to catch myself on my palms, pain throbbing along them. I'd slipped on blood. A lot of blood. I scrambled back up and followed the thick trail of blood towards the pod that had been designated as our social space. It was nearly as large as the sickbay and contained two worn couches that faced one another. A long wooden table had been set between them. The walls practically burst with a spectrum of different colors. People had put up posters, photographs, artwork, and every other possible kind of wall decor. The effect was overwhelming, but that wasn't what drew my attention. Katie stood facing the wall, and she had a bloody scalpel in hand. She stood next to a body. a man's unmoving, lifeless body. He was stocky and short and wore a simple black t-shirt and khaki shorts. I couldn't tell much else about his appearance. Because Katie had cut off his face. It hung down to his neck in a loose flap of skin. The muscles in his face glistened wetly, and his teeth were bared in an eternal rictus of agony. They looked impossibly white against all that blood. When I stepped closer, I noticed a series of red mouths scattered across his chest and stomach. Stab wounds. Katie rocked back and forth on her heels, mumbling incoherently to herself and slamming her head painfully against the wall of the compartment. Blood matted her hair. I couldn't tell if it belonged to her or the dead man. She didn't seem aware of my presence, but she still had the scalpel in a white-knuckled grip. Someone shoved me aside and I almost went down a second time. It was a man who'd pushed past me. A man wearing a lab coat. He was fair-haired and pale, and everything about him seemed flimsy and insubstantial, as though a stiff breeze might knock him over at any second. But he went straight towards Katie without hesitating. "Katie, put the scalpel down, please." She went still. Slowly she turned around to face us. She'd gouged out both of her eyes. Blood trickled down from the empty sockets and formed a grisly bib on her MIT hoodie. There was also a white jelly-like substance smeared across her cheeks, the remains of her eyeballs. I edged closer to her. She hadn't driven the scalpel through the bone and into her brain. She wouldn't bleed out from this. If we could just get the scalpel away before she did any more damage to herself? Katie uttered a broken, distracted laugh. "I'm so sorry, Ben. I'm so fucking sorry." "It's alright. It's going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay. Just let go of the scalpel." Ben took another step closer to her. "No, it's not. The doorway is open. It's wide open. And I don't know how to close it." In one swift movement, Katie dragged the scalpel across her throat. Bright red blood spurted out from the wound in rapid pulses spraying across the ceiling. I distantly noted Ben's scream of horror as I ran past him. The front of my mind was occupied with calculating Katie's odds of survival. Her left carotid artery was most likely transected, and at this rate she'd die within a couple of minutes. I slid down next to her and put pressure on the wound. I needed to clamp the blood vessel off. I ripped off the hem of my shirt and dug the strip of cloth through the wound and gripped the artery between my fingers, pinching it tight. But it was no use. My fingers slipped and the blood pulsed right past them, making me squint against the spray. She was going into hemorrhagic shock, her skin turning clammy and cold even as her heart rate rapidly increased. The Narrows didn't have any facilities for surgery, and there was no way for us to evacuate her to a hospital in time. She was going to die. "It's going to be okay, Katie," I said, speaking as calmly as I could. I even stroked her hair, though I doubted she could feel it anymore. "You're gonna be alright." Katie made a gurgling noise in her throat. She could have been trying to speak, maybe, but the sounds coming from her were slurred and unintelligible. She turned her head slightly, those empty sockets glaring straight at me, and it felt somehow as though she saw me. Even without her eyes, she saw me. Horror twisted through me, a sharp hook that threatened to unzip my guts. Part of me wanted to get up and run, to leave her lying on the floor. This time when Katie spoke again, I understood her. "It's here. It's already here. And it's inside." She shuddered all over and stiffened. Then she went limp, her jaw falling open. She was gone. I sat back on my heels, arming the sweat off my forehead, and looked around. The nameless dead man was still lying on the floor while Ben had slumped down, his head hanging down, and his legs splayed out in front of him. He didn't speak or move. Alexandra stood a few feet beyond us. She took in the scene with that expression, and then glanced at me in a wordless demand. "She's dead." And then, because I couldn't hold the question in any longer, I added, "What did she mean by 'the doorway is open'?"